So I recently picked up a Vita off eBay, and anytime I've talked with someone about adopting Sony's forgotten handheld, they always ask the same question. Why? Kind of odd being asked point blank about why you'd spend money on something, let alone just about everyone asking it. And the thing is, it's not unwarranted. The Vita has had a very turbulent history. Sandwiched in between the far more successful 3DS and the rise of mobile games on smartphones, the Vita simply hasn't managed to find its footing. At this point, it's not going to either. Sony has pointed out a few times that a complicated market is what led to the Vita's demise, namely with the increase of casual players getting their fix from cheap or free smartphone games. It doesn't take a genius to realize that this isn't the only reason the Vita has fallen flat on its face. Phones have likely hurt handheld sales to an extent, but the majority of the blame lies on Sony itself. Whether it's ignorance or arrogance, the Vita was sadly doomed from the gate, and Sony didn't give gamers much of a reason to try it out in the years after. First and foremost, the price. When the Vita launched, its Wi-Fi only model was the same price as the original 3DS, at $250. The real price difference came with the memory for the system. The 3DS could use just about any old SD card you had lying around, plus it was packaged with a 2GB SD card from the get-go. The Vita, on the other hand, didn't come with a memory card at all in its standard launch. Sony opted to create proprietary memory just like they did with the PSP. In doing so, Sony was able to charge exuberant prices just to have space to play your games. Naturally, this drove a lot of players off. As of this video, it costs less than $25 to get a 64GB microSD card for your new 3DS, but still costs upwards of $100 or more to get the same amount of memory for your Vita. That's insane. A lot of people will point and say the Vita has no games. That's obviously not true when taken literally, but to say that the Vita has few exclusive games is, well, that's correct. The few it's had, or does have, are seeing ports or releases on other systems. Even Sony themselves are doing this. Gravity Rush is one of the Vita's most critically acclaimed games, but earlier this year, Sony re-released it on the PlayStation 4. Frankly, you can't blame developers for taking their business elsewhere. The game you're seeing right now is called Severed. It's an interesting take on the first-person dungeon crawler that utilizes the Vita's touchscreen for combat and puzzle solving. It's arguably some of the smartest and clever use of a touchscreen a game has had to date, and there's a good chance you've never heard of this game. That's because Sony's marketing for the Vita is non-existent. Severed is, thankfully, coming to Nintendo platforms and iOS, meaning more people will hopefully get to experience it, but that just proves my point further. The Vita has turned into a haven for indie games and Japanese ports. A lot of these games, especially the former, are available on other systems or PC, but the key here is that the Vita allows you to take a version that's just as good as any other with you on the go. And while a lot of JRPGs and anime titles are going to fall into a niche, it's still an audience worth appealing to. Maybe move some units and make some sales, and to that end, Sony did nothing at all. The majority of gamers have wrote the Vita off, and you can't blame them. While it's great to play Hotline Miami or Splunky on the go, these games are available elsewhere, and when you've already paid once for something and quite possibly played the hell out of it before realizing or caring that there are other options, would you bother double dipping? That's not to say Sony didn't bother advertising. There was a media blitz before and after the Vita's launch, and it did focus on games exclusive to it at the time. Problem is, they haven't tried giving it much of a push since Borderlands 2 was ported to the Vita. And again, when you've got a game that you can get somewhere else, and in this case, a far superior version no matter what you played it on, would you bother double dipping? Of course not. Sony's focus was more on taking the game with you on the go. This makes sense for the handful of cross-play and cross-buy titles that existed for both it and the PS3. But not enough games took full advantage of this feature to make it count, and moving your save wasn't quite as seamless as Sony let on. Here's the thing. These are just some of the big things Sony's either neglected or forced on their audiences, in turn driving them away. The real shame here is that the Vita is not a bad system at all. If anything, it manages to correct a lot of mistakes the PSP had and is a superior device. PlayStation Classics, for example, are able to use DualShock controls for games that support it, such as Metal Gear Solid or Mega Man Legends 2. You'd think Sony would try to push that, giving an even bigger backlog to the PlayStation library with games that the PSP simply couldn't play. Instead, Sony has downsized the selection of PlayStation games available to the Vita for no real discernible reason. Try finding Crash or Spyro on the Vita. You can't. Same goes with PSP games. These work perfectly on the Vita, but for one reason or another, There are some titles that are purchasable on the PS3 and PSP, but not the Vita itself. Really, a big reason I bought the Vita, and the thing that Sony does slightly still market it for, was Remote Play. Remote Play works wonderfully, with no latency whatsoever, assuming your internet's good enough for it. Same goes with PlayStation Now, working just as well as it does in the PlayStation 4 or any other device that runs it. Look, at the end of the day, pushing indie games and games from 15 to 20 years ago aren't going to sell a system by the millions. But if more people were simply aware of what the Vita had to offer, it may not have floundered quite as hard as it did. You can't point to smartphones and say they're the problem when Nintendo is selling the 3DS like a hotcake still. In fact, sales of the 3DS jumped 80% recently due to Pokemon Go, a game on smartphones. The fact is, the Vita didn't have a chance. Not because audiences wouldn't give it one, but because Sony never did.